time. We are beginning to broadcast on YouTube. So thank you again, George, for having a chat with us. I think everybody knows George Siemens. He is first speaker in the world, maybe, and I'm sure he was in 2008 the first. 2008. But if you go ahead, 2008, he proposed the first book known as Collectivist and Collective Knowledge, I think. He developed a new theory about we call it collectivism. We'll speak about this later, I think. Also, I think there's a very holistic view of what the educational system is and could be in the future. So we have many talk, he gave many talk about these topics. And this year it was the head of a book research initiative, which was a great initiative about data collection for the books. So I think it's very nice to be able to begin this summer school with such keynotes and having a whole view of what MOOC and teaching and learning will be in the future. So thank you again, George, and I give you the micro. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, is that my indication to start?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to address this group. I apologize that I'm not able to address you in French, so I will revert to English. The only other language I speak is a dialect of German, and I don't think any of us would necessarily enjoy that presentation, so I'm going to go with my default English and just start with an apology. One of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about over the last few years, and I'll share some information or link with you. I'm not sure what the easiest way to do this, if I should do it in a separate email when I have a link, or if it's enough if I drop it into the text area here. So, for example, I just put in a link to MOOC research. If you would like that in a separate email, I can send that your way, or I'll just keep it on the screen. But what I'd like to talk about today is this idea of latent capacity. And that is the notion that systems have unused capacity, and when we see innovations in technology, they typically come because they take advantage or find a way to activate that unused or latent capacity. A few examples. Now, I know parts of this are U.S. Canada-centric. I'm a Canadian. I took a leave from Athabasca University recently to set up a research lab here at University of Texas, where I am currently. So we have a rather warm day here. I think it's about 37 degrees Celsius. And they tell me that this is just the start of summer, so I should start preparing myself for 40 and 43, 44 degrees Celsius. So I'm not looking forward to that. But what I have been spending a fair bit of time thinking about is how do we, in different segments of society, use technology to achieve things? So I'll give you a few quick examples. Just by quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of Airbnb? Okay, we've got, well, 2, maybe 3 or 4, okay. What about Uber or Lyft? Okay. All right, so there's one gentleman that he knows what's going on. You're dismissed. I have nothing else to teach you. So these are technologies, and I'll talk about them a little bit because of where I'm trying to go with this idea. So Airbnb is a software service. They don't actually own anything, but they have a larger market value than companies like Hyatt and others. But basically what happens with Airbnb is if you go out and you want to, let's say, rent your apartment to someone, or if you're traveling and you have a week of lag time and you want to earn a bit of money from making your apartment available to someone else, they can use Airbnb to find and rent apartments or a house or whatever you have. So let's say you decide you're going to take a 6-month trip to Australia, and you don't want to just have your home sitting idle or latent, if you will. You then sell that extra capacity to people who come by or who want to use the apartment. And Airbnb basically serves as a broker that takes that latent capacity of your apartment or your house and makes it available to prospective renters. Now, Uber and Lyft, these are slightly different tools, but they serve the same function. Right now, when you go, or let's say you travel to New York, you get out of the airport. In order to get to your hotel, most of you would hail a taxi cab. A group of individuals have created a platform called Uber, and there's another one called Lyft as well, which allows, instead of dealing with a taxi service necessarily, you have the ability to connect directly with someone who's in the area who will give you a ride. So if you log into Uber, and if you're known to the system, you have to have an account, and then it'll show who's nearby. You can request a taxi or a ride. It's actually just a ride from someone. They come by, they pick you up, they give you a ride, you pay them. And so it really replaces the idea of taxis. And Airbnb replaces the idea of renting. And what both of these share in common is that we have a very inefficient arrangement in our society with the physical things that we own. And that is that there's enormous latent capacity. We don't use it. It sits idly. And it's sometimes been called the sharing economy, but it's a bit different than the sharing economy, because we're technically, the thing that we're sharing is actually we're activating something that's not being used. And so those are just a couple examples. If you go back a little further in terms of the development of technology, you can look at Flickr, you can look at blogs, wikis. You can even look at a service called SETI at Home. I'll just type this in here for some of that. Basically uses spare computing in order to explore space and connect with life forms or whatever you call it. So if you see it on your screen, that's the service. But all of these, I would argue that every major technology that society has created over the last 15 years, every single technology shares one prominent attribute. And that attribute, that it activates unused capacity. Sometimes that unused capacity can be what we see happening, let's say, with the Arab Spring, which was initially a promise of democracy, but has not lived up to its promise. But it was individuals who took control of the power that they had to circumvent an established hierarchical system. Or if you look at what was happening with Occupy Wall Street several years ago. Occupy Wall Street was the same thing, where it was a group of individuals who wanted control over their destiny and didn't want a small group of people to control what they were able to do. This is the same general idea. There is this sense we're activating something. We're activating capacity, whether it is an apartment, a car, or whether it's sharing images, or whether it's forming social connections, or whether it's taking back power and control in our lives through networks or group systems. And so that's my core argument, is that many aspects of society are not optimized And when we get into digital eras or a digital context, we have to reorder the power structure within those systems. This has happened in the newspaper field. This has happened in a range of media and even music and entertainment. Some of them have been impacted at different paces, but essentially we have changed the relationship between producer and consumer, and we have changed the relationship between politician and the electorate. We have changed relationships between the company and the employee. So that's the prominent argument. Now, what does this mean when we start talking about learning or talking about education? Well, my view very broadly is that in a classroom, and I'll call this my 100 people theory of knowledge. So if you have 100 people in a room, they have enormous opportunity to teach one another, because every student, every person in the room has a different knowledge profile. And because everyone has a distinct, unique profile of knowledge, they are able to teach one another many things that currently are reserved for the faculty member. And so much like we would have latent capacity in vehicles or in apartments, in our school system, in our universities, we have enormous latent capacity. And what that means is, even look at this room right now. There are, I'm going to guess, I don't know, I can't count you quickly, but let's say there's 30 of you in the room. And all of you have had a different life from each other. All of you have different hobbies and different interests. The legacy system of physical space is structured so that even the chairs and the desks in the room are front-facing, with the assumption that the person up at the front of the room is the one that has the knowledge to share. Our physical spaces in universities, and as we move to the digital spaces are mirroring or capturing those physical elements. So let me try and communicate what that means. Going forward, thinking about the future of education, we will need a model that doesn't favor one person over 30 or over 300. We will need a model where learners teach one another rather than the faculty member being the sole instructor in the classroom. This is one of the interesting aspects of MOOCs, and if you talk to almost anyone who's run a MOOC, one of the first things they'll say is, well, first of all, from my experience, most will say, I've never been more excited about teaching. I feel like I have my passion back for teaching. Now, that's been a fairly common response I've heard from faculty who taught their first open online course. A second thing that comes up quite frequently, and this is anecdotal, is that faculty are surprised how well students teach one another in threaded discussion forums. How quickly students who have questions get their questions answered, and how quickly students can take an idea that one student has shared and create it into something bigger and more innovative than what that student has shared. So these short comments then are the context for my thinking of the future of education. And the future of education, what is required in order for us to take advantage of the latent capacity of students, is really twofold. And I'm just going to grab a quick link. I wrote a blog post on this yesterday because I've been thinking about this for quite a while, and I recently did a talk at edX on this same idea about activating latent knowledge capacity. So I'm going to drop the URL in here, and hopefully you can see that. I believe I saw someone in this room was tweeting, so hopefully whoever's been doing a bit of tweeting can share that as well. I think that was Alain or Jean-Marie. Anyway, there's a few of you that are. are sharing the tweet. So please feel free to tweet that out if you want it, or otherwise it just gets a little more detail what I'm arguing for or talking about here. So here's the core problem. The reason that we can't teach one another is because our school system doesn't focus on what we know. This is quite obvious in that we spend almost all of our time as faculty members creating content and creating curriculum. When I've been involved in creating new academic programs, whether it's at a bachelor's or a master's or a doctoral level, we always start with the content. So we have made content our primary focus. And yet what's really important in learning is actually the student, the individual. And it's been easier for us to take the student, or the content, because we can master the content and scale the content. But we can't do the same with students, because, and tutoring, if you have 5 students, works very well. But most of us don't have 5 students. We have 100 or 200 or even more. And so because our inability to scale the student experience, we've spent our time on content because that was an easier problem to solve. Well, now that we have better tools and technologies, we can start to scale the experience of the student, and we can start to create what I'll call a personal knowledge graph. Now, before I get there, I'm just going to pause just to see if there's any questions what I've talked about so far, and then I'd like to transition into talking about the role that Facebook plays in pulling things together and why that's important in helping us understand the future of learning, as well as what I mean by a personal knowledge graph. So let me pause here and just see if there are questions.
So we are actually together. Nothing. Okay.
No question. Did you want me to keep going?
Sure. Okay, go ahead. Thank you for giving us opportunity to ask questions, but we are faculty, we are not used to answer questions. Okay, thank you. Now.
Okay. I'll keep talking. If someone raises their hand, I'll stop. This makes me a bad teacher because I'm mirroring what I say we shouldn't do, which is just talk at students. It would be much better if we could sit in tables and small circles and talk about the things that I've said, and more importantly, disagree with them, because knowledge only becomes valuable when we have the ability to critique and build on one another's work and ideas. But anyway, so if I don't see anyone raise their hand, I'm just going to keep talking at you. So your punishment for not asking questions is to get more of a lecture. Okay. So the idea then, I started blogging in late 90s, and I remember when one Christmas, I think it was actually in Christmas of 1999, where there was a software tool called Blogger, which was started by, coincidentally, an individual who eventually started Twitter. But I remember I was trying to blog and share my ideas, and I was furious because Blogger kept going down. It had terrible uptime. It would go down for 2 or 3 days at a shot. There was basically 1 or 2 people maintaining the site. But even then, it was such a valuable tool for me to share ideas and connect with others that I continued blogging. And eventually I moved to a software called Movable Type, and eventually from there I moved to WordPress, which I use today. But in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a fair number of people in education who were starting to explore what in mid-2000 was called Web 2.0. Up until then, it was just blogs, and we used Delicious for social bookmarking, Flickr. We used early-stage wikis. This was before really Wikipedia was as big as it was. And this whole experience, the problem was that each time I wanted to use a new tool, I had to log into a different service, and I was unable to really have a fairly fluid, good end user experience. I had to use 6, 7, 8 different tools in the morning to do the things that I wanted to do. The problem then is that for a small percentage of the population, you're comfortable playing with different, who, let's say, fairly technically inclined, you're comfortable playing with different tools. However, for the majority of people, that wasn't a very inviting experience. So in late, probably close to mid-2000s, when Web 2.0 got started and a series of other tools became common, then Facebook came along and integrated all of those tools. And I knew Facebook was significant when I started having requests from my family members to be their friend. Up until then, in all my use of social media and blogs and other technologies, I never interacted with family members because they didn't care about those tools. But what Facebook did was it took all of these different tools, integrated them, and provided us with a good end user experience. This is the same problem that we have with learning today. We are learning in a lot of different places. Some of you may take a MOOC that's offered by a local university. You might take a MOOC that's offered from Harvard, or perhaps you're taking a MOOC that's offered by a Chinese provider or a Latin American provider. So the experience of learning, and you might use TED Talks, you might read academic articles, you might go through this range of different experiences, and overwhelmingly, you will have disconnected experiences. So the reason why we can't teach one another well in a peer setting is, first and foremost, we don't have an easy way to declare our knowledge. What made Facebook successful was there was an easy way to declare yourself, meaning that once you declared yourself, people could find you. So the first problem we have is we don't have an easy system for declaring the knowledge that we possess so that others can find it and we can be more active in teaching one another. A second challenge that arises, which I just addressed, is that we don't have an integrated system for pulling those knowledge elements together and presenting those knowledge elements to end users and individuals. Right now, even if you look at the MOOC providers, with the exception of NovoEd, which is an initiative out of Stanford, none of the major MOOC providers provide learners with a good profile, meaning there's no communication to date of which courses you've taken. There's no communication to date of the learning that you have done, namely the knowledge that you possess. So there are a fairly broad range of missed opportunities there. And this gets back, just to tie this back to my first point, this gets back to the problem that I listed at the start, which is we have latent capacity in our classrooms, and we have to develop the tools that enable us to connect that latent capacity. Because the future of education is not going to be the classroom model that we have today. The future is going to be decentralized, networked, peer-driven, an entirely different power relationship than we have today. We'll still need experts, we'll still need teachers, but a lot of what they do today, individual learners can do for one another. So in order to get there, my argument is there are a few things that we need to do in order to make this happen. So on the one hand, first of all, we need to semantically define knowledge spaces or knowledge disciplines. So if someone wants to be a nurse, we can, through a relational approach, identify the skills and knowledge that a nurse needs. That's what we do with all of our curriculum now in our universities. The second aspect is this idea of a personal knowledge graph. Much like Facebook gives us a social graph or LinkedIn gives us a social graph, in a university context, we need a technology that gives us a knowledge graph that says, what does George know? Or what does anyone in this room know? And that can be done through a variety of ways. One, it can be done through a formal university system of marking and grading, where you submit an assignment, a teacher marks it, and that moves back onto your portfolio or your learner profile. Secondly, we can explicitly enter it ourselves. We might have taken a series of MOOCs and we want others to know that we've taken these MOOCs, and we can detail in our profile the MOOCs that we've taken, and then expect, hopefully, that others will then give us recognition for that, or maybe an employer can come by and assess whether we've learned that or not. It can also be about the different tools and technologies that we have in different experiences. So I might have been involved in a hobby in my summer months. There has to be a way where that's captured and shared and moves into my knowledge profile. So that's my big argument. We've done a good job of defining curriculum. The critical step going forward is we have to do a better job of articulating at a nuanced level what each individual knows, because the only way we'll activate that latent knowledge capacity in this room is if there's a way for you to know what the person beside you knows, so that you can find the right person to ask questions or to seek guidance on. So that's sort of the main point I'd like to communicate in that regard. I want to talk very briefly about some research that we've been involved in more recently around trying to identify the role of technology in the learning process. And so what happened was a colleague at Athabasca University, Dragan Gasovic, took the content of a MOOC that I ran in 2011, it was called CCK11, and analyzed the relationship between students and faculty and course content. And this is a huge challenge educationally, is even though technology essentially enables us to distribute previously coherent wholes. Let's say an album before Napster was a whole. It was an entire unit. Napster broke it down into songs and individual elements. A newspaper was a coherent whole. Well, today most of us get our news through an article here, an article there, and a mess of different news sites. The same thing with tools like Twitter and Facebook. So all of these technologies, they've done a fairly good job of breaking apart coherent systems of information. But the real problem comes in that learning is actually a coherence-forming process, which means that when we're learning something, what we're essentially learning is how are the pieces connected and how do the pieces relate. So even the tools that we're using now, whether it's MOOCs or whether it's learning management systems or virtual learning environments, or whether it's social media or even classroom settings, mobile learning, those technologies still pull the learning experience apart. And this presents us with a substantial problem in getting to a better sense of what each individual learner knows. And we are basically, for lack of a better word, waiting for our Facebook in education. We're waiting for the tool that allows us to define the knowledge that we have, whether that knowledge is explicitly defined or automatically mined from our patterns of interaction with others. We're waiting for the tool that allows us to pull together the learning that we're doing in a bunch of different spaces, a lecture hall, a classroom, a MOOC, a community learning activity, so a way that we can stitch all of these together into a coherent whole. So that's sort of the point we're at, or the stage that we're waiting for. One of the most interesting aspects that we found with the analysis of the MOOCs was the level at which learners in distributed environments created centering technologies. Now, one of the prominent centering technologies that learners created is called a hashtag. So they use the hashtag CCK11. And this was a way, even though students participated in a lot of different spaces, this was a way where they could quickly find the central conversation. So CCK11, if they searched for it in the tools that they were using, or if they subscribed to it on Google Alerts, that would provide them with an update. So that's just one illustration of learners defining their social interaction and their learning outside of the central control of a classroom. What that does secondarily is it elevates the relationship that learners have with content without the faculty member being the primary influence. So we found in one of our points of analysis that a hashtag was actually more important for learners making sense of the course than a faculty member. Now, by more important, we used primarily the metrics of influence, and we used primarily the metrics of dialogue that students engaged in, meaning that they used a hashtag as a centering element for distributed content, and the faculty member was a node within an overall network, but not necessarily the critical node. So that's about all that I wanted to share briefly here related to the experience and what MOOCs, the way that they might impact the development of knowledge graphs and opportunities for educators to start thinking more innovatively about what a university might look like in the future when we have less latent knowledge capacity in the classroom because learners are more engaged with one another and with content. So I'll pause there and see if you have questions.
Somebody has questions? Perhaps could you precise the way we can observe the relationship between the learner and the content? How can we take it?
Okay, your question broke up a little bit just as you were asking. Could you please ask again?
Yes. You say that it was very important to catch the relationship between the learner and the contents. How can we do that? Technology, with the technology.
Okay. So I hope I've got the question right, which was about capturing the interaction between the learner and the content. And it's different. Let's say if you may want to mute the mic. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but as long as it works for you, that's fine. It's fine by me. It's just getting a little bit of a blurb occasionally. And you can just do that on the laptop, obviously, on Google Hangouts. So the way to capture interaction, so I'm going to we recently did an event, and the reason why I'm bringing this up here is we have most of the videos recorded from this, but last week we had an event at Harvard. It was our Learning Analytics Summer Institute. Second year we've run it, and it's part of the work that we've done with the Society for Learning Analytics Research. And I was the founding president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, and much of our effort is on capturing and understanding student data. And that student data can come from a range of different approaches. The easiest way is to have the data in a system that we control. So let's say students learn in a VLE or in an LMS. Well, we can track the students' interaction. We can look at how long they read a web page. We can look at if, let's say, there's annotation functionality for reading. We can also see how the learners are interacting with text. Are they highlighting text? Are they annotating it? Are they asking questions about it? And we look at the log files from the server regarding the frequency of student login, the duration, the entrance and exit pages, videos that they've watched, if there's a part where they rewind a section of a video and they watch it again. So these are all different types of data that we're collecting about how a student is interacting with the content. Now, we can collect additional data around social networks and systems that students form, but some of the work of people like Carolyn Rosé, for example, looks at the analysis of text and what that tells us about students' development. Or I have a colleague that has looked at the community of inquiry model and looks at the text that people are creating and sharing, and whether they can extract the quality of learning, concept development, cognitive presence, teaching presence based on the language and dialogue that students engage in. So on a quick level, if I'm getting your question right, is we can do a lot just with the text and the trace files or the trace data that's generated by students. One of the drawbacks, though, with that approach is that in a learning management system or a VLE, students are scripted about what they do. So it's not necessarily authentic learning. The trace data that we receive, we've told them what to do. So we might have said, you know, these are your readings this week. Ask one question about your readings in a discussion forum and respond to another student's request. So that is just an example of how we shape the behavior. Then if we evaluate these discussion forums, we've essentially told students what to do. A more authentic type of interaction is the data that we would collect in an open or a distributed course. So sometimes a term has been used as CMOOC, but it's just basically a course that is not run in a centralized system like edX or Coursera or even a VLE at a university. The problem, though, is that data is analytically cloaked, to use a statement by Dan Southers. It's hard to stitch together a Twitter profile with a student ID in a course with an individual's participation in an existing MOOC. So that's when it gets more complex, is how do we stitch together fragmented data? The point I made earlier is getting a coherent assessment of a distributed process is a very challenging activity. But if we do it right, it also gives us much richer and more authentic data because the student did these things because they wanted to, not because we told them to. So hopefully that answered your question. Otherwise, I just talked at you for a while about nothing.
No?
Yes, are there already some references about that? Can we put some, yeah. There are some papers or stuff like that? About
Sorry,
that context tracking.
Okay, I didn't quite hear the question. Could someone else refer, someone closer to the microphone state it was a little quiet?
The question was about the videography references. Some references concerning just what you said.
Sorry, the mic was just...
Sorry. Okay. So the question of Flo was about references, about just what you said about complex knowledge, and not the question.
Data in Facebook, Twitter,
How to collect fragmented data from Facebook and to analyze them onto all the process of this fragmented data.
Okay, I think I got it, but the question was, how do we pull together and analyze data that comes from Twitter and Facebook and other technologies? Was that the question?
The question was, yes, that's the question, but the question is about having papers, references, articles about this.
Okay, so first of all, if you're looking for resources, I mean, very broadly, there's a couple options. One is we just recently launched the Journal for Learning Analytics, and if anybody's interested, it's just off of the Solar Research website. So this is an area where we have individuals starting to look at exactly that problem. There has been some outrage recently with a Facebook research project that happened in the US, but could have been students anywhere or individuals anywhere. And so there's ethical issues about pulling data together from different sources. And certainly if you influence the nature of that data. So I'll give you one example where I think we handled it reasonably well ethically. So with the MOOCs that I've taught outside of a major, and I'm doing a MOOC on edX in fall on data analytics and learning. So that MOOC starts on the 22nd of October, which looks at some of these elements. But what happened with an average process with the MOOCs that we ran, so we would have students that would use Moodle as a discussion forum. They would use, in some cases, Second Life. Keep in mind, this was back in 2008. I don't know if anybody is using Second Life anymore in education, but in 2008, it seemed like everybody was. And they used Net Vibes. They posted on blogs. They created Facebook groups and a range of other things. Now, at that point, we used a very simple approach. And so it was a software that was written by a colleague, Stephen Downs, called Grasshopper, and the GRASS stands for RSS. So what initially used to be far bigger online, which was just this simple XML wrapper around content, so that you know what's happened or what's been updated, and that was quite important for blogs, for example. It enabled you to interact or to read blogs because it had the content that you could just follow and who's updated what. So it was a simple model. So we would the students would submit their blogs to the central site, and we would take that blog feed and we would store the content that students had posted and send it out in a daily email. We would also take hashtags that were used on Twitter and cache those as well. And any other sources, if there was a Moodle forum that had an RSS output, we would use the RSS from that and also save that. So the way we centralized it was every student in the course would get a daily email newsletter that listed any discussion that happened on blogs, on Twitter, on social bookmarks that were shared, Moodle discussion forums, and so on. So it was a process of centralizing that interaction. Now, for those of you that are familiar with RSS, you'll realize that it's not a terribly sophisticated type of technology. It works very well for sharing quickly and easily, but it's mainly a pull technology. More recently, what we're looking at now is to use APIs to serve as that integration approach. So application program interface is just where a software provider makes certain parts of the data available for others to pull from the system. And so going forward, I think we'll probably find greater focus on APIs as a way of making sense of data from different systems. There are questions about how do you store that data. You have to have a centralized data schema. Some of the work that Martin Hoxie has done around Tag Explorer, using different Twitter tags and seeing the social networks that form, is promising in that regard. But it gets back to a point I made earlier, which is that we have fragmented, decentralized tools, and in education, we're waiting for our Facebook, a tool that pulls these things together and makes it an easier process for the majority of individuals. Now, if you want articles on this specifically, I think that was another part of your question. We've published the LAC proceedings, so that's LAC, the LAK, Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference. They've been published as in ACM proceedings for the last 4 years now. And so you'll find articles that address exactly that question. Some of the work by Dan Suthers, especially from 2011, is probably the most relevant to the questions that you're asking.
Okay, thank you. I have maybe two questions because about what you said. The first one is about to be able to define, to have a semantic profile of knowledge, because most of your talks before was about emergent knowledge, was about creativity, was about new knowledge. How do you imagine to be able to profile such emergent knowledge as most profile or semantic-based schemes are predefined schemes? So we need something more dynamic than classical semantic schemes.
Okay, so if I interpret it correctly, and again, the sound is a little bit echoey, but what I heard you ask was about creativity and innovation. Is that correct?
Creativity, innovation, emergent knowledge. How do you put those kind of things in the knowledge graph? Yes, that's what you said. The knowledge graph, the semantic profile.
Yeah. Well, that's a great.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that we're struggling with, quite honestly, because so first of all, one of the valuable aspects of giving students control and activating the latent knowledge capacity that exists in any social or human setting. The big or the promising opportunity is around ways for us to build and improve and create. So much of what happened with Web 2.0 initially was something as simple as being able to embed a video. I mean, there was a time where, for now it's assumed, but previously you had to either link to it or you had to download and then upload it to a server. So embedding a video in a web page was a neat way for people to be able to take an idea and mash it up. So you post the original video, embed it, you redo it, you add a different voice layer to it, or you do whatever. Sometimes these are called memes, but this is where you basically create and innovate and you build on the ideas of others. So any type of technology or any type of learning going forward has to emphasize creativity above rote learning. And the reason why I think that's so critical is if a problem is known, then you just have to find out the person who has the answer. But as we're aware of more and more as society becomes more complex, is that problems aren't readily known. We're dealing with complex problems that don't have a simple solution. And if you have that kind of a problem, the answer is contextual, and the people that are involved have to often be creative in solving it. You can't just find an answer that someone else did and then duplicate it. So in that regard, we have seen with Web 2.0 and with other technologies, whether it's Facebook or again, going back to memes, human beings can be incredibly creative. If someone does something silly, then it doesn't take long, and somebody has created GIFs of it or animated GIFs that are just a way of being creative with the ideas of others. And knowledge has always been this way. When we cite someone in an academic article, it's basically we're mashing up their work. We're taking an idea someone else has had, testing it, challenging it, perhaps improving it, perhaps trying to refute it. So that's an example of creativity, is creating something new, often out of the work of others, sometimes out of something that we ourselves have created from scratch. So the personal knowledge graph, there needs to be a way to account for creative acts. Now we can, at some level, get at things like a learner's disposition or learner mindsets or different kinds of frameworks. We can also get at things or affective attributes. So the knowledge graph should be more than just what a person cognitively knows. It should also include elements such as what a person has, attributes that that person possesses. Research indicates, at least it's prominently shared in the U.S. about the value of persistence or the value of grit. That if you stay focused on something and if you work through frustrations, you'll typically be more successful than someone else who gives up easier. So those are the types of opportunities that I think we need to be aware of as we create a knowledge graph, that it can't be a mechanical representation. It has to account for a range of creativity and innovation elements that are often difficult to manage or to evaluate, but we can still have some commentary on it, even though we might not be perfect.
Okay, that's just a part of the question. The other part is about new knowledge. How do you include new knowledge, new content in such graph? Is it a dynamic graph concerning the whole knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, it would have to be a dynamic graph, much like there is a, if let's say our LinkedIn model. Now, a social graph is different than a knowledge graph, because a social graph is really about our relationships, and it doesn't really get at the content that flows. So if you look at social graphs, you'll see who's connected to who, directionality, but you have to add another layer if you're going to provide content. So a knowledge graph is quite a bit more complex, but it should be updated continually, and it should be updated as close to real time as possible, so that once I learn something, the software system that I'm interacting with should record that, either automatically mined, or I would have to make that statement explicitly that I've just learned this. But it's not an easy process, needless to say. The broad idea that I'm trying to communicate with it is that the technical implementation of a knowledge graph, we already have it in bits and pieces. We have it in the profile that a university collects about a student. Our transcript, when we graduate a program at a university, is a type of knowledge graph. It's just not a very good knowledge graph because it doesn't get down to details. It's not granular enough. A good knowledge graph would allow us to get to specific knowledge elements, not just courses completed or modules completed. So right now, the university transcript, the type of a knowledge graph is too broad. And secondly, it doesn't take that outside of the workplace where
Sorry, time out. The sound is very poor. Just we didn't hear you very well. Last seconds. The sound was a nightmare.
Okay.
Okay, so.
Okay, so.
Argument again?
The last point I made was that a university transcript, when you graduate, a transcript or a list of grades and courses taken is an example of a rudimentary knowledge graph. But it's not sophisticated. It doesn't get down to individual or specific skills. It might say George took a course in physics or George took a course in psychology, but it doesn't tell you what exactly I learned or the exact details. A second problem is that the knowledge graph only the transcript of a university only includes the formal learning that I've done. It doesn't include learning that comes from hobbies or collaboration or personal writing and thinking.
Okay. Somebody has another question? Okay, so
but one question, but I'm not sure this microphone is working. Is this one? No, this one? Okay, can you hear me? I was wondering about how can we make this happen without thinking about technology side? Because we talked about research. The question that was asked before was about references, academic references, and for me, the main point, like in the Facebook example, is a technology issue. We have technologies, we have some kind of API and so on, we have things that we need to develop. It's not a real form of knowledge, rather of deploying the implementation.
Yeah, well, I think your point is critical. The approach needs to be something that is not front and center. It needs to not be intrusive in the learner's experience of learning. I don't know exactly what or how we would design it from an end user's perspective. So let me give you a quick example of a research grant that we just put in here at University of Texas a week ago. And so what we wanted to do was to look at, in the U.S. there's a term called underrepresented students. These are students who typically are marginalized. They may come from a lower socioeconomic background. Often they're Hispanic or black students, so they have colleges that are called HBCUs, which are historical black colleges and universities, or HSIs, which are Hispanic serving institutions. So the grant we focused on was using a personal knowledge graph to improve the success of underrepresented students. And so what we did there, because you're 100% correct, that technology should not be the focus, that technology should fade into the background as much as possible. And so with this grant in particular, the emphasis is on how do you create a set of tools and resources that ethically mine data of student interaction and infer from those data what a student knows or what they learned. Now, if you're familiar with educational data mining or even learning analytics, there's It's still not very sophisticated, but we can track cognitive growth. Like as a student learns an idea or a concept, we can track that often through language analysis or through the way in which they're creating or sharing ideas, whether a student has mastered a particular content or concept or idea. So that's one issue, is that the student as well needs to see their own knowledge graph. So the knowledge graph isn't just for the institution. Much like we have technologies now that allow us to quantify ourselves. These are with wearable devices that we use to track heart rate, or that we use to track, might record diet and so on for counting calories, sleep patterns. There's this app I had on my iPhone that would basically track the patterns while we sleep. And so I would set my alarm, and if I was in a deep sleep, the application would determine to put it on your bed, so it would determine movement. So if I was in a deep sleep, it would know that I could wake me up at that time. And instead, it would wait until there was movement in the accelerometer in the iPhone, and then once there's movement, the alarm would go off at that right time when I was not in a deep sleep, which means it would be not quite as rough a morning to start. And it would do that within, let's say, a 30-minute window. So it would, but that's just one example of quantified self, where we have the tools and technologies to monitor ourselves to give us insight that we might not have otherwise. And they're rudimentary. Like a lot of what I'm talking about here is still very much an ongoing research project. It's not that there's an absolute answer for it, but that there's a better sense of what we might do with it. So that's with this initiative I mentioned with the underrepresented students. We're looking at developing a knowledge graph for each student that each student has access to. That includes both cognitive elements, but also their affective elements, and that then, to as large a degree as possible, provides a good end-user experience where the student is not being directly or obtrusively asked to intervene, but instead the system minds and provides direction back to the students when they're not involved in optimal learning activities.
Marie?
I didn't catch the main point of your conference. Could you re-explain why is it necessary to get the knowledge graph of the students? I don't know why it is so important. I didn't catch it.
Sure. So the point I made is that all of the major technologies of the last 15 years share one common element. They activate the latent capacity that exists as we transition from physical to digital environments. I used a few examples of Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, but it could also be Facebook or Flickr or blogs. What these technologies have done is allowed people to declare to others something. In the case of Uber, they can declare to others, I have an apartment that can be rented. Or sorry, Uber would be a vehicle, or that can be, I can give you a ride. Or Airbnb, where it says, I have an apartment that you can rent. So the ability to declare something, and then by declaring it, to connect it to someone else who needs that, is the process of activating latent capacity. In our classrooms right now, we don't have a good way of identifying the latent knowledge capacity. So let's say you look at the people in the room. Now, I don't know how well you know each other, but the lady that asked the question, if you look at the gentleman beside you, can you tell me what he knows? Or can you tell me his skill set? Can you tell me his social attributes? You might be able to, if you know the individual reasonably well, you might be able to say, yes, I can do some of those things, But if I was to say, well, can you let me know if that person can teach you about the influence of centrality and in degree and out degree in social network analysis? Chances are that specific granular level of knowledge, because we have to first declare it and expose it before someone else can discover it and find it. So that's why the heavy emphasis is on the knowledge profile development, because we will not be able to activate the latent knowledge capacity of people in a room until we do a better job of declaring what individuals in that room know.
So you mean this knowledge graph is a declarative knowledge graph more than how to say an analysis of what people have already done. So is that? Oh, I don't know how to say that in English. En gros, l'idée c'est que c'est déclaratif, tout c'est tracé par le système. C'est ça la question. Okay, we switch in French, that's not good. The question is, you say that the student has access to his knowledge graph, but does he declare it, or is it the whole system that makes the knowledge graph and the student has only access to it? Because in your point you say we must be able to declare what we want to share. And the point, if you say that the universities that say what you already know, that's somebody else, that's the whole system that declares what you know already know. So that's something different. The system is controlling the knowledge graph, or the students controlling the knowledge graph. That's part of portfolio in other places.
Okay, so there's a few things there, and if I interpret it correctly, so first of all, it is at this stage an idea that we have many of the pieces already. So what I mean by the system declares the knowledge. So it's this, let me rephrase that. So the first part of your question was that the system, there needs to be a way for us to share with others what we know. Now, we could, if somebody sat me down and said, George, do you know this about statistics, or do you know that about physics? I could say yes or no. But we need brokering elements when we have more than a handful of people. Just like the best way to teach would be to teach one faculty to one student. Well, that's not economically feasible. So we teach one faculty to 20 or 30 or 100 students because we can afford that, or, well, it's more affordable. So that is the primary argument around the need for learning analytics in education, or even a knowledge graph. It's because we aren't able to scale the one-to-one teacher relationship. So then we rely on technology to help us make sense of the world. It's just like going back to Airbnb, the service for renting apartments or houses. If I knew everyone in a city and I knew who was leaving and who was staying, then I don't need that brokering technology to play that role. But I don't know that. So then I need a brokering technology. So if I know you very well, then I don't need, and you don't need, a knowledge graph for the purposes of our interaction. However, if you have a lot of students in a room and you can't know everyone, or you might only have them for a semester, then you need a knowledge graph in order to broker the relationship between what a student knows, what they need to know, and what they can teach to others. So when I say you have to declare what you know, what I really just mean is making that transparent. Just like LinkedIn, the social graph on LinkedIn doesn't declare explicitly everything that you know, or everyone that you know. I mean, it's not like you have to say, at one point you click to follow someone. But LinkedIn continues mapping interactions and groups and conversations in the background, and it keeps it updated. But because it's updated, it makes that transparent and available to others. not sure if that gets at your question, but I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then I need to get going if there are any others.
Okay, my feeling is that there is a gap between personal knowledge graph and activation of latent capacity. Because, my feeling is that it's not sufficient to have the personal knowledge graph to be sure that you are able to activate the latent capacity. Because maybe you need to have some technological tools, you need to have several people, several learners, and tutors maybe for activating something. My feeling is that it's not sufficient, but maybe I didn't understand very well. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, so keep in mind, here's where I was going with my talk, which was I was trying to articulate what is the condition that the university will find itself in the future. Right now, early stages, even the technologies that we use are basically a reflection of the classroom environment. If you use a learning management system, or if you use an asynchronous platform like Adobe Connect or Blackboard Collaborate, it still has this same model of the teacher in control or one voice speaking at a time. If we learn lessons from other fields that have transitioned, the physical to digital transition, which is a dramatic transition, when that happens, it changes fields, because like I mentioned right up at the start, is that it changes power structure, and this process of changing fields, moving from physical to digital, then enables us to activate the latent capacity that exists within systems. The Arab Spring, which, as I mentioned, didn't quite turn out the way many of us were hoping, was an example of individuals taking control that they previously had acquiesced to a central government or a dictator or an unfair society. The tools for taking that control were mobile devices, Twitter quite often during the Arab Spring. This is how people organized. This is how people could declare and say, I'm over here at the square, join me over here for a protest. So to get to your specific question then, that the reason the knowledge graph is what I'm arguing is the thing that will help us as educators move from physical learning spaces to digital learning spaces, because it will, and with that transition, everything that goes with it, such as the student has more control and autonomy that the student doesn't have today, peer-based learning that the system is not well equipped to handle today. Other activities could be related to the process of knowledge development in peer systems that the university doesn't necessarily do a great job of, especially at a bachelor level. Once you move up, there's a little bit more of that in the university. So that's my main argument, is that the knowledge graph, once we have that, we can do a better job of activating the latent knowledge of each individual student, and it will help. And there's other approaches, it's not just one thing, but it'll help universities transition from physical to digital spaces.
Lo has a very last question.
Yes, just last one. I'm sorry, a theoretical one. I'd like to know what is the difference for you between distributed cognition and connectivity?
Okay. So I hope you have another hour. I'll keep it short. So here, and maybe it's easiest if I clarify what I mean with connectivism. So with connectivism, I make, and others that have been looking at this in different ways over the last, I guess it's been about 10 years now since I did an article on it. But with connectivism, here's my argument. Knowledge is a networked property, and the experience of learning is one of forming, pruning networks. Now, where distributed cognition emphasizes obviously the value of artifacts and spaces, and I frequently use from Solomon's text on distributed cognition and statements from Roy P. and others as well in my presentation. But so in that framework, it looks at cognition and thinking across a range of spaces, not necessarily just physical. I mean, not necessarily just people, it could also be objects. So where my articulation with connectivism differs is it would include that, but I say that learning happens at 3 levels that's networked. And I had an argument with a colleague on this a few years ago. He's a very aggressive constructivist, social constructivist. And I asked him, I said, well, biologically, how does learning occur? Like, from a constructivist lens, what is the biological thing that happens when people learn? And his response was, I don't know and I don't care. And so I've been thinking on that statement for a while. Now, I know constructivism has a lot of different flavors, so someone else might want to answer that. But the 3 levels at which I say learning is networked or connectivism exists is, first and foremost, connectivism exists at a neurological or biological level. When you and I learn something, there literally are neurons forming, connecting in our brains. There's a biological process of learning. We don't understand it terribly well yet, but going forward, I do expect it will be society's period, like neuroscience will be one of the sciences that contributes most to the understanding of humanity in the next several decades. But and there's enough that we understand even now that something as simple as learning a new idea, it's not centralized in one part of the brain. Some of the work of Olaf Spons, for example, emphasizes that at the neocortex level, we see a similar formation of network configurations that we see in other network-based systems. We see hubs, we see weak ties. So biologically, we can explain learning through a network lens. So that's stage or level 1. That's the neurological, biological basis of learning. The second way in which learning is networked is at a conceptual layer. And this is, call it linked data, the semantic web, whether you see the work that Newton and companies like that are doing where they're trying to articulate relatedness of ideas or activity that has happened, particularly in physics, around concept mapping. But at a conceptual level, it's essentially saying that knowledge is a networked activity. So this concept relates to this concept in this way. That's the heart of science, I would argue, is this process of exploring the validity of relationships between ideas. Historically, there was a period of time where the health community thought that if someone was sick, one way to treat them was through bloodletting. You let them bleed out. Now, that was the case for a period of time, but today we would say those concepts of bloodletting and health don't necessarily make sense. We have more sophisticated ways, and we use randomized controlled trials and so on to find the quality of a relationship between two entities. So one of those examples would be, penicillin. Does someone who takes penicillin, do they have a more positive health outcome than someone who doesn't? Well, with enough evidence, enough research, we can now say the concept between disease and viruses or bacteria and illness, that we now understand those concepts better than we used to. So that's an example of a conceptual layer. Or, why do we have seasons? Why does the sun rise in the east and the west? We've tried to explain that in the past, but we've now come up with more empirical or more sophisticated statements about why that's the case. That's the second stage at which knowledge is networked. It's at this conceptual layer. The third stage where knowledge is networked is the social and external stage, and this is where connectivism shares the most in common with distributed cognition. And these are the social and technological systems that form our cognitive capacity. So if I need to learn something new, or if, let's say, I'm going to start a research lab, I have to be able to identify the right configuration of people who bring new or novel knowledge to that lab so that it has the maximum impact or output. So that's the short summary. The 3 ways in which learning is networked in a connectivist framework is biological, conceptual, and social external.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm out of time here. I think you probably have you should be drinking wine by this time already. So thanks very much for your time and your question.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure for us, and hope to see you again.
All right, take care all. I'll hang up now and enjoy the rest of your institute.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.